Okay, welcome to the second panel of our meeting. I'm Mario Diani from the University of Trento. And we have quite a dense schedule, especially because we are running a little bit late, to put it mildly. So let me just, we have four speakers, Sophie Body-Gendrot, Lydia Morris, Marisol Garcia, and Enrico Pugliese. And with the previous format, we'll have about 5 to 7 minutes in the average for the speakers, and then will be slightly more time for the commentators, and then a reply from the speakers. And all that in 1 hour and a half. So we have to keep tight. Let me start by keeping my introductory role to the very minimum. The title of the session is Citizenship and Welfare, and if we look at the paper, they are quite unsurprisingly diverse. They actually published in different sections of the book, but still, I think the merge, putting them together in this particular session makes eminently sense. And I don't pretend that that there is not a single line when you're facing reading interesting work. There are always very different takes you can take. My own take of this paper, in the attempt to identify at least some common themes, has unsurprisingly, given my professional focus, to do with the theme of the conditions and forms of collective action and the changing conditions of collective action in urban areas. And if you think, really, I think if you start with a very basic distinction that Charles Tilly, borrowing from Harrison White, did when he claimed that the collective action is fundamentally the result of the intersection of categorical traits of the actors, properties of the actors, and networks and the interactions, and the mechanism to bring social actors together in meaningful social groups. Well, I mean, if you take of those two basic mechanisms, you can easily find a lot of interesting material in the four papers we're going to discuss. I'm sure that discussion will identify still more themes, but certainly, in many ways, these papers speak to, at least on this ground, to some kind of common element. In particular, with different accents, both Morris and Pugliese look from very different angles to the role, to the impact of migration dynamics. Pugliese more specifically focused on that. Morris in the context of discussion of the various factors that have altered the conditions of citizenship in the UK, of which notoriously migration has been a big player. But nevertheless, there is an element, there is a recognition of the changing conditions that have brought about the crisis of the idea of citizenship, in particular universal citizenship, and the basis that it provided for effective collective action in industrial society. And this is certainly a theme which is worth investigating. On the other hand, Body-Gendrot and Garcia, perhaps in relative terms, give more attention to the issue of explicit radical critical collective action. Perhaps if I read them right, they will correct me in case, with different emphasis in terms of optimism. Body-Gendrot is very explicitly in pointing out the fact that grassroots initiatives and new forms of protest, urban protest per se, will not be enough as sources as agents of change unless there is a deep effort to tackle the institutional structure of contemporary capitalism. And Garcia gives more, perhaps again, she may correct me, is slightly more, it takes a more Southern European perspective, and perhaps it's more optimistic in the role that the actions that developed since the 2011 on the role that those actions might play in altering the political landscape. But in any case, this is something we are going to hear from them. I won't dwell any longer, and I won't exceed my role any longer. I will have to keep the time very tight, because there is nobody who's better than the Swiss to take time, I will use some kind of advanced Swiss technology, which is from a conference in Zurich I got. 5 minutes, 1 minute, and stop. So okay.
How long have we got?
I mean, 7, if possible, 5 to 7 minutes each.
5 to 7
minutes each.
They have 10
We
minutes.
can, it's negotiable.
We can bargain.
They have 10 minutes.
We can stretch, okay. We are granted 10 minutes, okay.
Don't reduce the time. 10 minutes.
I wish I knew. Help from the, yeah, it works. Mm. No, no. That's me? That's you. Okay. Well, hello? Any local who is familiar with the local system? Thank you very much. Thanks for the effort. Saskia Stassen doesn't look. Okay. Not a great start.
Okay, so you heard a lot. Thank you very much for inviting me and can you hear me this way? Anyway. No, I can't. Anyway. You heard a lot this morning, and you will find some echoes in what I say this afternoon. So I will start, since my talk is about public disorder in an era of globalization, I'll start with cities, large cities being where multiple global processes assume concrete and localized forms, but the multiplicity of presences in the urban landscape makes cities a contested terrain in which disorder happens. And such cities experience continuous mutations generated by global forces in a global context of uncertainty, unpredictability, and fears. So if you take two instances that are well known, the corporate players and the migrant workforce, those are instances of transnationalized actors, all claiming their right to the city, but in an asymmetric way. They challenge the city and its weakened democratic capacity, and we may wonder, like Ray Powell, whose city is it? What is the background for protests? Well, the global context makes people insecure, even outraged. And there are numerous reasons that we heard this morning from Saskia, the systematic logics of expulsion at work, the abuse from financial and political forces, leaving people without property. This gives way to moral panics, anxiety, a disenchantment towards the democratic paradigm. And we think that protest and urban disorder refer to an inability to think urban change in the long term. New phenomena happen, but we are unable to interpret correctly their meaning or even to perceive them. Our methods and paradigms are not appropriate at this moment. Silent dissent may then appear as a healthy form of post-political empowerment by opposition to social alienation. Post meaning that protesters do not need words for expression, since they do not negotiate with power holders from whom they expect nothing. We may wonder what part the city's spaces play in this protest. That's a familiar picture. What is new in my research is that I look at how globalization amplifies local disorder in the occupant movements, the riots, condenses time and space, gives local events a world echo via social networks. Networks interpret local disturbances, they globalize them. Smartphones, websites, social media link dispersed people, create visibility for local mobilizations, and local space is reinterpreted, a global drama organized in contentious territories. Yet I claim that clicking I like is very different from participation in a specific space. Now, I deal a lot in my work with disorder and order, the dialectics, because both are linked. Disorder can only be understood by reference to order. Some forms of disorder are harmful, this we know. Order is needed for societies to function. Yet, some disorder, like civic disobedience, for instance, is a necessary step in the adjustment of change. The future order is inside the disorder, the transitory disorder, which acts at its envelope. The notion of intricacy actually would be more appropriate. So my research explores such differences. Now, the police are an essential piece in the dramaturgy of protest. According to Bittner, the police are the public institution that better do something now when disorder erupts or even before. And despite the legitimacy of mobilization, order wins, sadly. Order wins via multiple public tools like emergency laws, specialized and well-trained anti-riot police, justice acting in real time, preventative arrest. And in mobilizing such tools, cities reveal their know-how in halting disorder. They benefit from a historical experience. They are not under siege. Protest movements are modes of dissent, giving visibility to what is usually ignored on the political agenda: injustice, emotions, inequalities. As Hannah Arendt said, protesters have the courage to start something without knowing the end. Remember, November 2011, 900 cities were occupied. The political power of space is too frequently ignored. Yet, I claim that their capacity for change is very limited. After mass protests marked the 60s in American and European cities, the corporate world and its established allies kept pushing the disadvantaged who were losing their right to the city to the margins. Neo-capitalism did not become destabilized by the denunciations of the dispossessed, unable to ally with the discontented. That's us, May 68. We occupied the space, and we were rather powerful then. Powerlessness today comes from the fact that multifaceted wicked issues like inequality, racism, defy simple solutions. There is neither agreement on their nature nor on solutions. By essence, as Saskia said, the city is a frontier space between worlds ignoring each other. Take the migrants. The thought of migrants settling in neighborhoods where they are not welcome or landing on beaches where middle classes families take their vacations in Greece, Italy, or France comes to mind. And to quote Enzo, these mobile migrants with complex transnational identities are now facing political and cultural contexts in which social rights are weak and discriminatory and xenophobic practices are widespread. The capacity of not seeing them is limited. And remember those two words, hospitality, it has the same roots as hostility. In the past 50 years, neoliberalism has reinforced itself. It has become anarchic with no one at the helm, under strong winds. Yet it is in critical condition. The decline of economic growth, the rise of public indebtedness, the ascent of inequality of income and of wealth, feed rage and disenchantment. States are accused of being in the grip of money-making industries with an increasing stake in runaway financialization. In France, and I don't know about Italy, 60% of people think that political parties in no way contribute to the solution of their problems. So the political sphere needs to be reframed or even reinvented so that democratic societies based on citizens' rage, energy, and debates on the institutions that they want becomes possible. All institutions are indeed instruments which have transformed people into citizens. And to conclude, I would say that we need to rely as much on cities as on indignados and should not wait for the current financial system to perish to act. If cities are more resilient than other systems, it is due as much to their capacity for adaptation and innovation as to their incomplete features. The more they are comfortable with uncertainty, allowing options to emerge, the less they feel threatened by it. Currently, they take the lead on global warming issues, early education, and on the migration crisis. So there are still numerous unknowns to be deciphered, however, and we need to understand emerging situations while they are still in flux and subject to influence. New patterns arise, and so do pictures of acute uncertainty, but with new concepts, categories, tools, methods, embryos of change that are already visible, may be tracked and questioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for keeping straight. Thank you for keeping straight to the time. Now, Lydia Morgan.
Well, I've shared with Enzo over a number of years an interest in the fields of welfare and migration, and intriguingly, these are two fields that have traditionally been treated separately in the intellectual division of labour. But there's a reason now for thinking of them more as occupying the same field. And this has become a pressing issue in Britain. Welfare and migration have been brought closer together by the comments of notably David Cameron, who's described them as two sides of the same coin. And associated with this is the claim that we can't control welfare dependency without a reduction of migration, and this is what was launched as part of the famous austerity drive, where we've seen increased conditions and sanctions placed on welfare recipients, with cuts and freezes used to promote labour market change, with the aim of reducing demand for low-skilled labour, and along with that, reducing the recruitment of migrant workers, and most particularly from Europe. Now, the political message in both of these fields has been quite explicitly a moral message of earned entitlement, and there's been a moral mission of change associated with both fields, which raises the question of how to build a unified frame of analysis. And in fact, with the rise of increasing conditions and contractarian model of social rights, echoed by a drive for enhanced control over migration, it's no longer adequate to assess migrants' rights against citizens' rights, with citizenship acting as the notional yardstick of full inclusion, without now turning corresponding attention to how far citizenship falls short of that promise of full inclusion. And this moves us onto the terrain of rights, not simply understood as formal legal entitlement, but rather as a social and political construction in a field of contestation. So that's been the impetus of my own work. And in fact, the relationship between citizenship, migration, and rights is by no means settled. Academic understanding of these relationships has shifted over time. So from Hannah Arendt, we had the conception of the right to have rights, which was an argument that only those with full membership of the polity actually had a means of claiming their inalienable human rights. This argument was reversed by post-national positions that felt national membership was seen to coexist with the presence of non-citizens who had a significant array of rights. And this was taken to herald a new and more universal conception of citizenship. But we've now seen a further reversal, and we must now turn our attention to the erosion of citizenship rights, which can no longer be thought to function as a source of guaranteed inclusion. And even Marshall in his day observed that a stratified status was creeping into citizenship. And this observation actually foreshadowed a situation whereby rights function less as guaranteed inclusion than as a tool of governance. So in contemporary Britain, this governance has operated through increased conditionality and constraint as attached to a whole array of rights. And the promise of guaranteed inclusion for citizens has been all but eliminated to the extent that there are now over 1 million people in Britain dependent on charitable food banks. So sociology has seen two challenges to Marshall's model. One from the inside, with cuts, conditionality and surveillance attached to welfare for citizens, and one from the outside, with arguments about the development of cosmopolitan or post-national society. But in fact, neither of those ideals has ever approximated fulfillment, and they are both now simultaneously under challenge. So how do we approach this conceptually? My own work for some time has used the concept of civic stratification taken from David Lockwood. This refers to a system of inequality by virtue of rights granted or denied by the state, has a formal dimension of inclusion or exclusion, and has an informal dimension linked to what I think of in terms of moral standing in society. And in fact, this idea of moral standing or moral resources is very significant in Lockwood's model. He argues that moral resources indicate the ability to achieve one's aims through shared moral sentiment. What that means is there's a kind of dynamic of expansion built into his conception of rights, and claims to rights are then driven by the accrual of moral standing in society. But this model actually neglects to consider corresponding contraction. So how does the erosion of moral standing act as a prelude to the denial of rights? And that's what seems to me to have been happening in Britain. We've seen the operation of a declared moral mission to replace welfare dependency with increased conditionality, tighter control of migration, to the extent that these two groups, welfare dependents and migrants, are set against each other, all under the banner of a morality as fairness to the hard-working taxpayer. This is the recurrent slogan that we see. So we've seen contractions of rights for welfare recipients through cuts, freezes, and conditionality, linked to attacks on migrants as the cause of welfare dependency, and also further paired with allegations of the abuse of free movement in Europe and the claim that the British benefit system has acted as a magnet for migration. And there is the core of the explanation for the Brexit result in the referendum on EU membership, I would say. Can go a bit further in thinking about this with the notion of a moral economy. And this is, in this sense, not contestation from below, as in the original conception of a moral economy, but rather an imposition from above. And it rests on the idea that all economies rely upon some kind of underpinning moral frame. And in Britain, that moral frame has been driven by shrinking repertoires of desert that set migrants and lower class citizens in opposition to each other. Both groups have been deprived of moral leverage by a government discourse of abuse. And so we can see how civic stratification starts to offer the basis of a framework that can integrate analysis of both domestic welfare and transnational migration. We can see how a regime of rights is open to manipulation by the state in pursuit of policy goals, how the deterioration of moral standing leaves both migrants and welfare dependents vulnerable to the erosion of their rights. So an integrated analysis requires some documentation of formal entitlement, but also its relation to moral standing and the role of political discourse in the erosion of the moral standing of both groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We now move to Marisol Garcia.
Okay, good afternoon. Let me start by thanking very much the organizers and editors of the book for having done this wonderful work. And of course to Enzo for inspiring us through the years. And since I met Enzo in 1988, I think, I was very struck by his emphasis on social fragmentation. And so as a bit of a tribute to him, my contribution to the book was about one of the questions he put them, and he continues to discuss about the social and political consequences of social fragmentation. He already told us this morning about the main problem of disembeddedness and the market logic and consequences of commodification. I want to emphasize very, very shortly about the political consequences, basically in Southern European countries and cities in the context of austerity policies. Austerity in the European Union and European continent had not been distributed equally, partly because the previous economic trajectories of every country. But Southern European countries have suffered considerably. And one of the consequences of these austerity policies had been the flexibilization of the job market and increasing job precarity and unemployment, basically affecting a whole set of social groups, but as I say, as a concentrated group, sort of a young population, which are better educated. They have expectations as well as educational resources and social networks resources. So here we have this generation who, by the standards of what it would be societies with some as Lydia was saying, moral ground and citizenship understanding will be participating in society. However, with the Great Recession and with the austerity programs following the Great Recession, we find a tremendous frustration of opportunities for this generation. So here I argue that this can be framed, going back to T.H. Marshall, in his distinction between quantitative and qualitative inequalities. Quantitative inequalities is a matter of degree, but he said, well, qualitative inequalities is more drastic, it's a drastic differentiation that leaves some members of society feeling more at the borders, and somehow it touches their status. So my argument is that this new context for these very frustrated, let's say, opportunities to their expectations had felt qualitatively damage in terms of social inequality for their prospects, their careers, the possibility to bring up families, etc. So they have actually, instead of acting for exit or loyalty, they have acted in terms of voice, and they have organized. And they had organized, first of all, in cities. So this is around 2011 when the whole Indignados movement appeared in the cities of Spain, Portugal, Greece, also in northern cities, but at sort of a stronger base in the southern European cities. And their claims were claims for respecting social rights, bringing back true democracy. I mean, one of the calls were they don't represent us, you know. Therefore, they were not only questioning a social citizenship damaging situation, they were also questioning democracy and political citizenship. And my argument is that these groups had managed to steer and to bring back the question of this citizenship as participation. And they had not only brought up in cities, they have organized politically, and they had managed to occupy city councils, to get into local elections, occupy positions in city councils, regional councils, and in some cases arrive to national parliaments. And that's the case in Portugal, it's a case in Greece, it's a case in Spain and Italy, but somehow there is an unequal outcome of this political struggle that was born in city and scaled up to other levels of government, in which, in some instance, like the Portuguese case, there is a capacity, has been a capacity to actually coalesce with trade unions, and I think this is basic difference. Or in the cases of Spain and Italy, there has been more radicalization and, in fact, politics against the social democratic parties. And, well, in the case of Syriza, it's been an internal transformation. And my main argument is that even in these movements, reaching politics and bringing back the question of citizenship are actually pushing for some alternative policies only by trying to enact the social contracts or trying to work something more comprehensive, they can bring some real social change. No by acting, let's say, politically fragmenting. Thank you.
It's going to be an amazing session. Never seen 3 speakers in a row that end before their time limit. It's fantastic. Now, Enrico Pugliese.
Thank you. Okay. The title of my presentation is International Migrations and the Mediterranean. The first part of the title is clearly understandable. The second part is a little bit more complicated. What is the Mediterranean? Why is it important to talk of the Mediterranean? Of course, we know the Mediterranean is a sea, which is divided in other smaller seas, Tirreno, Ionian. But according to the French school of the Annales, the Mediterranean is an historical actor, is a subject, is something more complex than just a space. It's more complex than just a space, and as space is very difficult to be defined, because it does not have a Schwerpunkt which is the same forever. Of course, Italy is in the midst of it, but Italy has not always been central. Does not have clear boundaries. Where is the Mediterranean? Sometimes the Mediterranean shrinks, and it's just, you know, the coasts around the sea. Sometimes it goes east, and then you have, for example, the rule of the Ottomans on the Mediterranean. And they are pretty far away, you know, from the center of the Mediterranean. And so this fact that it is never exactly the same thing, it is influenced by what's happening outside, but influences very much what's happening outside, even at a long distance, and this changes from time to time. And it's also a subject which can be very divided. First of all, also the Mediterranean, you think, as a space goes left, was east to west and south to north. We see it north to south. If you see the Middle Age geographic cards, it goes from south to north. The south is on the top and the north is on the bottom. But another difference is we as Italians, for example, we think the Mediterranean is something that was only north-south, not east-west. Just the refugee crisis of 2 years ago made us think that the Mediterranean was something that could go also from east to west. Now, what's happening in this, in the most important and today's important direction, south-north, is that while we are discussing about Trump's wall against Mexico, we have a wall of water, which is the Mediterranean. That is, in the Mediterranean areas, which is much, much larger than the Mediterranean itself, we had the limes up to the 50s, up to the, you know, Trente Glorieuses, that crossed Italy. I mean, you had on the one hand southern Italy, and then Spain, and then Greece, and then Portugal, and people migrate from southern Europe to northern Europe, central and northern Europe. Now the limes shift south, and now we have the people moving from everywhere, but particularly today from Africa, through the Mediterranean route, the south-north Mediterranean route, and the limes is the Mediterranean. This gives reason to the idea of the opportunity to apply to the migration studies the schema, the theory of the long durée. You see it absolutely in a perfect way in terms of international migration. Of course, some centuries of separation and of different relation between the North Shore and the South Shore have enlarged the distance between the South and the North. Now the distance has been shortened. Physically, the distance is the same, but since 40 years you could go with 2000, it's in the last decades you could go from Tunis to Palermo with 20,000 lire, the equivalent of 10 euros, and now you can go with 50 euros. On the other hand, you cannot go anymore because the frontiers are closed, and the wall is crossed very often, but is crossed through implying tragedies. What is the point of the relevance of the Brodelian view for migration? Is the fact that all the Mediterranean countries of the southern shore of the northern shore, they have the same migration model. That is, I have not time enough The 1 minute there is wrong. It's 5.
No, come.
Don't cheat, please.
No, I was just getting ready.
Okay. Now,
You're 5 minutes more.
okay, thank you. A model has some features which are steady and consistent through time, and that are similar at all the parts in the case of some countries, and in the case of the Mediterranean, in all the countries that are part of the Mediterranean. So, consistent features. Which are these features? Why there is something specific in this Mediterranean migration model? There are some features which in part are effect of historical contingency. Like, for example, migration today happens through closed frontiers. So you have to enter these countries illegally, practically. You know, in Italy, the majority of people that you find in Italy now as foreign people who were not born here entered the countries in an illegal way. And this is the same in Spain, is the same in Portugal, is the same in Greece. Some entered also legally, but are a minority. This is the effect of a contingency. But there are some aspects that are really the effect of tradition which have to do with la longue durée. Like, for example, family patterns. Family patterns which, by the way, are pretty similar also between the north and the southern shores. I am from Calabria and I know this very well. I discovered some, okay. But particularly the similarities you find among the different southern European countries. We have in Italy the name for, a special name for the women immigrants who are caregivers. We have not exported the model because the model existed also in the other Mediterranean countries. All Mediterranean countries are familist. I mean, it's part of the cultural pattern of the Mediterranean. And when it is the case to take care of the elderly, since the process of modernization, even women emancipation, has caused a loss of availability of a loss of labor force available for uncommodified care within the family, then you have to buy with state money because you get the pension and then you buy the care on the international labor market and you have the care drain. The care drain, it's a phenomenon typical of the Mediterranean. And it's typical of the Mediterranean because the Mediterranean family, because of the longue durée, has this idea that you cannot put your aunt, your mother, your father in a care house. You have to take care of them. Since you are not available, then you buy the service which is commodified, but it's a very peculiar way. This is one. The other aspect, there are many other aspects, I cannot enter into the details, that show that how the similarities are not only effect of historical contingencies, but are effect of history. Apart, there is also nature. I mean, we have a Californian model of employment of foreigners, but in the Fordist migration, practically there was not employment in agriculture in Europe. They were industrial workers, so they worked in public work. Now they work in agriculture. We have a Californian model. And this has to do also with nature, but we also do also with the agrarian regimes and things. To conclude, there is nothing to conclude because the story is very long. My idea is that these aspects have to be taken into account also to explain what's happening now. Italy has been able in a way or in another to manage international migration when it was strictly labor migrations. Even refugees in Italy did not apply because it was too difficult to get the refugee status, so they waited for an amnesty, which we had each fourth year in Italy. Now, the situation is changed. I mean, people came from everywhere in the world and they were all absorbed within this Mediterranean way of managing immigration. But then the situation exploded with the so-called refugee crisis. With so-called refugee crisis, a new type of people arrives that the Mediterranean countries of the Northern Shore are not able to deal with. You may have a spontaneous, grassroots type of solidarity which is expressed in a good way. We have solidarity even within the armed forces. The Italian mercantile maritime, marina mercantile, would you?
Merchant Navy.
And also military navy, military, have expressed the highest degree of solidarity with the immigrants. On the other side, in the country, a kind of syndrome of invasion is happening because these people who are arriving are people, we, the Italians, and we, the Italian institution, and we, the Italian public opinion, which is really absolutely under attack from the political entrepreneurs of racism, are not ready to manage with. And this is one of the most focal points, not only in our nation, but also in the other Mediterranean nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I got a colleague in Trento, when he is given 10 minutes, he usually speaks for 50, so it's wonderful to be here and see all the speakers that take the chair seriously. Thanks to everybody. Now, to the discussion, Fabio Quassoli.
I'm sorry. Why should I apologize?
First of all, let me say that I'm truly honored to have been invited to this conference where we are discussing a tribute to the scientific work of Enzo Mingione. I have been working with Enzo for more than 20 years. I learned a lot from him, both as a researcher and as a teacher. I could also appreciate his generosity in many occasions, and finally, I firstly met most of the people who have been invited in this conference thanks to Enzo, so thanks. But coming to my role, I will try to provide a transversal interpretation of your chapter presentation, mainly chapters, highlighting some common assumptions, issues, and conclusions. I will also refer to some specific arguments you have focused on in your chapters. And finally, I will add an issue mainly, about which I will be glad to listen to your replies. A common starting point of your presentation that is, again, totally consistent with what is discussed in Enzo Mingione chapters in the book, concerns the disruptive power of contemporary capitalism, driven by the accelerating pace of technological innovation, the growing financialization of the world economy, and by a complex, omnipresent, and digitalized global communication network that allows for a growing deterritorialization of societal processes and, borrowing from Bauman, an essential fluidification of any kind of human relations. At the same time, all of you pointed out the role played by, toward the recent welfare crisis, by the predominance in both North America and Europe of a neoliberal political ideology that has been promoting over the last decades, on one hand, a constant weakening of regulatory measures implemented by the state to control the action of the market and to redistribute the wealth generated through basically capitalistic labor relations, and on the other hand, the reconfiguration of the system of protections provided by the variety of welfare regimes that were built during the Trente Glorieuses. Another relevant issue that is very much present in your analysis concerns the transformation of citizenship that you investigated at different scales, transnational, national, local, and urban, mainly, and from 5 different perspectives. A juridical one that has to do with the formal rights granted to those who are recognized by some government body as full citizens of a state, or not, denizen, for instance. I'm thinking here especially to the chapter by Lydia Morris. A political perspective concerning those who are socially defined and perceived to all intents and purposes as part of the national or local political community, and those who are put outside any polity, of course, a perspective that is present in Lydia Morris, Marisol Garcia, and Enrico Pugliese chapters, A bureaucratic perspective, Lydia Morris again, regarding the role played by the implementation of social policies in effectively granting social rights. So not only formal, but what happens when measures and rights are granted to people and the policies are implemented. A conflictual perspective where the main actors are social movements promoting political, mostly urban mobilization, aimed at redefining what citizenship should be. I'm referring particularly to Sophie Body-Gendrot and Marisol Garcia chapter now. And last but not least, as something that has to do with the urban spatial dimension when a symbolic redefinition and reappropriation, or maybe a production of new urban spaces are at stake, as it is stressed again in your two chapters by Sophie Body-Gendrot and Marisol Garcia. Talking about citizenship put almost automatically in the foreground the issue of international immigration, an issue that is central in both Lydia Morris and Enrico Pugliese chapters, since most of the challenges that have been posed to what we can call traditional definition of citizenship comes from the way both national and transnational governmental bodies define the path for the incorporation, inclusion, insertion, integration of the newcomers into existing political communities. I use on purpose 4 categories, as I was asked to discuss even a fifth chapter by Jean-Claude Barbier, who is not here, but I refer also to his chapter, in order to hint to the relevance of a critical analysis of the conceptual toolbox we use to address such complex and delicate social processes. I'm following here Jean-Claude Barbier chapter, who, drawing again from the seminal work done by Enzo Mingione on concepts such as underclass, new urban poverty, and social exclusion, say that our main categories should be handled very carefully since they bear a heavy political and ideological burden that can lock up sociological interpretation into the national, cultural, and political context in which social scientists live and work, strongly limiting the sharpness of their analysis. If I have time, I will come back to this point in the final part of my discussion. The link between immigration and the reconfiguration of citizenship rights bring us back to the changes that are affecting welfare policies in Western countries. As Lydia Morris clearly highlighted, addressing the British case, immigration and welfare transformations, contractization, should be analyzed through a common analytical frame because the redefinition of social rights for the domestic population has been taking place together with stronger control on immigration and asylum seeker mobility. Moreover, the restriction over the condition of entry and residence for international migrants and the former reconfiguration of citizenship right has been accompanied by discourses on the moral standing of particular groups, migrants above all, that rely upon the same repertoire of moral categories, deserving, undeserving, that have been used to address, classify, and treat and evaluate welfare recipients. To keep on my attempt to summarize what your chapter have in common, I would like to introduce another issue that is explicitly stressed by both Sophie Body-Gendrot and Enrico Pugliese, and that could be relevant for many of your arguments, in my opinion, and that, by the way, is one of my current field of research. It concerns security policies and discourse, and more broadly, a process that can operate at different scales, and that we can define, borrowing from the Copenhagen School, as securitization. Let's start with the urban level, recalling that despite the fact that public discourse on governing urban security traces back to the development of modern city, the recent growing urbanization of security has generated both new specific problems, risks, and new kinds of people behaviors that need to be governed. As far as Italy is concerned, for instance, over the last 2 decades, many crucial issues regarding the governance of metropolitan areas, traffic, immigration, work, pollution, criminality, of course, peripheries, and even freedom of religious expression have been reframed thanks to the partially new semantic umbrella of urban security. In many official discourse, the complex issues of urban coexistence and city government have been dealt with, identifying a specific threat against which urgent and exceptional measures have been solicited, thus underpinning a process of securitization. Besides, Insofar as issues concerning urban security, disorder, and crime came into view and made a fast career in public debate, in public discourse on city governance, the securitization of broader sectors of urban life has been accomplished through a shift from a conception of urban policies centered on social problems that calls from social policy, to a different one that sooner or later ends up being centered on situational prevention and criminalization of urban problems, conflicts, and groups. Drawing from the work by Robert Castel, we can state that the balance between civil and social security shifted dramatically to the benefit of the former, at least in the last few decades. As far as the relationship between neoliberal governance and security policy is concerned, a useful insight has been provided by David Garland, who has highlighted the spread of a culture of control, defined by a shift in criminal justice from penal welfarism to an orientation centered on crime control, which implies a decline of the rehabilitative ideal and the renewal of punitive segregation. In the same framework, attention to the interest of the victims increases proportionately. And where an individual victim cannot be identified, the existence of a sort of collective victim, that is the local community with its standard of life, quality of life, is often invoked. Thus, the new culture of control relies upon a conception of a community whose identity is defined in purely negative terms. Because social bonds are supposedly created through collective victimization, and whose borders are defined by referring to the threats raised by constant waves of incivilities and deviant criminal behaviors. However, insofar as a sense of community does not rely on a process of social and cultural integration, but on a collective shock, those who commit crimes or behave improperly perform the crucial function of reconnecting people and places through the defense of a territory, usually public urban spaces. If we change scale and consider migration control policies at the European Union level, we can say that over the last 3 decades, migration has been mostly linked in official documents, normative provision, political statements at the European Union level, of course, to representation of societal dangers. According to Jeff Huisman, as a technocratic, a politically manufactured spillover of an economic project of the European Union internal market, immigration and asylums have been integrated into a policy framework that defines and regulates security issues arising from the abolition of internal border control. The fear that the free circulation of people and goods inside the Schengen area would not only improve the free movement of law-abiding agents, but would also facilitate illegal and criminal activities by terrorists, international crime organizations, as well as by asylum seekers and migrants. It was in one of the pillars of the Schengen Treaty, explicitly stated. Since the early 80s, discourses that were already circulating at national level, mostly among the political and technocratic elites, and that represented migration and asylums as a security question, had penetrated the Europeanization of migration policies and found a sounding board in the European meetings and documents, thus reinforcing and legitimizing national debates. Very quickly, those discourses promoted a rather scary and disturbing representation of the European Union that was acutely synthesized by Saskia Sassen through the metaphor of Fortress Europe. As I already mentioned, security policy is a specific policy of mediating belonging. Indeed, the political and social identification of a community and its way of life develop in response to an existential threat. Such a process excludes, by definition, migrants from the normal fabric of society, not just as aliens, but as aliens who are dangerous to the reproduction of the same social fabric. The discourse frames the key question about the future of the political community as one of a choice for or against immigration, but, of course, it is not a free choice, because a choice for immigration is represented as a choice against the survival of the political community. In the last issue of Ethnic and Racial Studies, Catherine Witold de Venden wrote that controlling the European Union borders, the external European Union borders, in particular through the externalization of border control to migrants' country of origin and transit, allows us to circumvent a liberal paradox. As far as migrants are prevented to cross the European Union borders, we do not have to cope with the paradox between effort adhering to human rights on the one hand, and those controlling the migrant population on the other hand. Together with this first paradox, she points out a second one, a welfare paradox, which holds that there is a tension between social rights for all on the one hand, and the deregulation of social and labor rights and standards as part of a liberalizing global economy on the other. The hypothesis here is that a decrease in immigration lead to fewer forced migrants competing with established non-migrants for public services and jobs, and welfare provision, of course. However, as many researchers have demonstrated, the representation of forced migrants as exploiting generous welfare states and competing in labor market does not necessarily comes out from high or increasing numbers of mobile border crossers. Restrictive policies in themselves harden the image of migrants as potential economic competitors. Besides, following an argument by Lydia Morris in her chapter, we can add that citizenship rights restrictions for migrants today points out an ongoing change that tomorrow will concern everybody, foreign as well as domestic citizens. A problem that was addressed long ago by Abdelmalek Sayad when he talked about the mirror effect of migration. A final observation concerned the need to critically apprise the vocabulary. Yeah, how many minutes? Stop. Oh, sorry. Okay, I can stop here. I'll skip my last point, but we can discuss it later. No, okay.
I didn't mean so abruptly.
Sorry?
I didn't mean so abruptly.
So abruptly.
But okay, well.
If you give me 2 more minutes, I can, okay.
Mauro Magatti.
Thank you very much for inviting at this seminar. Well, I met Enzo 30 years ago. At that time, I had a degree in economics, and I wanted to become a sociologist. So Enzo suggested me to read and study Carpolani, which in fact is still nowadays one of my favorite authors. In an age of instability, I appreciate the fact that Enzo is still loyal to his original inspiration, and in this book we are discussing today, is still going back to the double movement, disembedding and re-embedding, as the central analytical tool to interpret contemporary capitalism and its transformation. In fact, neoliberalism may be interpreted as a doctrine, disconnected economy from society, synthetically expressed by the so-called trickle-down effect. And in fact, the neoliberal form of capitalism has been extremely effective in fragmenting social life, establishing its own hegemonic view over the entire society. Through individualistic consumerism, neoliberalism succeeded in establishing its own disorder, even among groups which supported the negative effects of its own disorder. As a matter of fact, fragmentation, a different word to say disembedding, is an analytical and not simply a descriptive word. In this framework, I would like to make 2 general points which come to my mind reading the 5 chapters we are commenting in this session. The chapters show that during neoliberalism, the re-embedding process has been rather weak, for at least 2 main reasons. The first is that re-embedding has mainly to do, in this period, with marginality and informalization, as for example in the migrant communities or in the urban peripheries and slums. Generally speaking, the re-embedding processes have impacted in the local communities and in the informal economy as a surviving strategy unable to change the social equilibrium. Above all, re-embedding has been detached from any idea of change or of social transformation. The second reason comes from the uncertain relationship between disembedding and social conflict. On one hand, the disembedding has been so deep to block even social conflict. After 2008, we saw a few examples of citizen upsurge in a few cities, but this was a limited process, and we saw protest rather than conflict. That is, protest means no view about change in the long run, as we listened before. On the other hand, re-embedding has been a strategy to build defensive strategies used by some social groups against others. For instance, in the gated communities or in the reaction against migrants communities manifested in the last years in many cities. This observation lead me to a general consideration. I agreed with Enzo and Polanyi that the disembedding process tends to create its own reaction. And cities will be are the places where changes tend to occur. But we should consider that the two, that is the disembedding and re-embedding, as a polarity which establishes a field of tensions rather than a two-step process. In this polar field, we see dynamic and unstable equilibria, which may be catched by the notion of Simondon of metastability. That is, I suggest to use differently the relationship between disembedding and re-embedding. When there is disembedding, certainly a re-embedding process is stimulated, but in a sense, this is to say nothing. In fact, what this perspective suggests is the problem, that is the concrete nature of this process, which may take very different forms. The second point I would like to make here concerns the analytical level the embedding process has to be applied. In Polanyi approach, re-embedding has to do mainly with social ties and reciprocity. But in fact, re-embedding may take place at a higher level, that is, at a political level. And this is a crucial aspect to be considered. In the last 10 years, that is after the 2008 crisis, something started happening. After the crisis, the basic movement in social life has changed direction. What is going on is an attempt to reestablish a more stable relationship between economy and society, as Trump demonstrated. This shows that re-embedding may involve very different directions. At stake nowadays, in this post-2008 phase, there is now social bond, but this may be regressive rather than progressive. That is, I'm saying that re-embedding is not positive in se, may be, on the other side, very problematic. From this point of view, I think that we should have a more complex theory of re-embedding dynamic, much more complicated than Polanyi's ones. And these 2 points I made, that is, what is the analytical level of this re-embedding, disembedding process, and the first question about what is the relation between the two. They create a polar field or whatever.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for a round of responses from the speakers. Let's try to keep it to 4 or 5 minutes at the most. Who was first? Sophie?
Well, I think I take what Fabio was reminding us about the reappropriation of a space, an urban space. I think one of these phenomena is perhaps comes across not only what I referred to, the political organization, especially of the young population in Southern European cities, but I think also relates to migrants and also to also social conflicts. So perhaps we can talk more about this reappropriation of urban spaces. There has been this argument among many people about how under the right to the city has been like a sort of a slogan in which many organizations had come back, claiming back the city and claiming urban citizenship. And I think urban citizenship has been instrumental, at least we know from Canadian cities, also for migrants, because some social and civic rights that get more difficult to get at the national level, they can start operating at the local level. So perhaps it is worthwhile to remember that a way back, as Enzo was commenting today, in actually reenacting the state, is a different kind of a state. It's a more collaborative state with civil society and solidarity groups and social reciprocity, and that takes place in cities. So this creation of urban spaces may or may not lead to political spaces, which goes back to my argument. The question is that I will put again on the table how fragmented that politics still is, because the alliances between all from the radical left to the social democratic solutions to the conservatives, I think is still very, very problematic. So is it perhaps a way to create a new enactment of citizenship, sort of bottom up? And I think it's happening very much at the organization and innovative practices. And in that sense, these new youth organizations and these social movements have been very effective. My contention is about when they're trying to do national politics without the cooperation with traditional workers' unions. So perhaps, it's going back to the question that you were putting now, this sort of re-embeddedness, but what happens with traditional organizations which had been diminishing their power? And with that diminishing power, how can we force regulations on the state? Because the state is still there and it has a function. Whether there is a for redistribution or pre-redistribution, still I think it has a function.
I'll just pick up on the point about disembedding. I've puzzled over this myself, and I'm inclined to agree with you that there's an assumption that the re-embedding only happens in a particular way, whereas if I look at my own argument and the sort of material that I've been researching, and particularly in relation to political discourse, I'm kind of inclined to say there's a re-embedding from above, and this is partly what's intended by this reformulation of the notion of moral economy, whereby there's a morality implicit in a political position, and this is the political task is then to embed that in the general populace. And so, yeah, I'd be interested in trying to develop that further conceptually. So I think you were suggesting that re-embedding can happen at a higher level than local interactions, reciprocity, social networks. I think that's an interesting idea, and the scope to take it further. But then the question arises, I suppose, and this is, I think, what Marisol was gesturing to when she talks about fragmentation. Is there an alternative way? Where would the alternative values come from in that scenario? Some people have looked to universals, although certainly with respect to social rights, the purchase of universal standards has been very slight. So you're looking to ways to build bonds across groups which have been systematically divided, and this is what Enrico's talking about, I think, as well. But it did strike me when preparing my own work, you know, it begs the question, could this be put together in a different way? So, you know, I gave you the moral message of the Cameron government. Is there another message? Well, I mean, the first thing of interest is that actually the position that has been adopted in Britain has no foundation in official empirical data. There's no support for it. The economy is desperate for migrants. Migrants do not claim disproportionately from the welfare system. And indeed, British citizens do not disproportionately abuse the welfare system. So all of this actually can be empirically challenged. Furthermore, the groups have a number of things in common. So deteriorating standards of employment affect all groups. The erosion of welfare standards affect all groups. The increased level of surveillance and control affect all groups. Massive deterioration in local authority spending affect all groups. So here is possibly an alternative moral economy for a re-embedding of values, but you know, it needs the mechanism to bring those things together.
I try to express in a more clear way what I intended to tell in the last part of my presentation with a premise. When I was writing this contribution, Enzo Mingione was writing his essay on the double movement. He did not know that this would have been used for his celebration. But what I remember that I liked this idea of work on the dual movement, the Polanyi's dual movement, and I understood, I assumed on the basis of my, well, on the basis of the reading of the, basically of the Great Transformation, but particularly of what Enzo was writing at the time, that put it in a very trivial way, this embeddedness was bad, was when, you know, the penetration of the market destroyed the society and blah, 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 and re-embedment was a good thing. And so in a way, Lydia, as it very often happens for me in studying her work, is able to add something new in the analysis and not foreseen before. Today she introduced the concept of re-embeddedness from above. Re-embeddedness from above is a bad thing, it's not a good thing. It's the dark side of re-embedding. And she has done the same operation on another concept today. We were talking of this when we were coming in the taxi here, that is the moral economy. For me, the concept of moral economy was something that concerned the good, solidaristic values of the peasantry. The moral economy of the peasantry was an economy which assumed that there was not only the law of the supply and demand, that you had some moral responsibilities in dealing economic affairs. This was the traditional understanding of the anthropologist of the moral economy of the peasantry, the only moral economy that I knew. Now, Lydia presents to us another understanding of the moral economy, which maybe would have been better defined moralistic economy. That is that from above, you are given a frame whereby, according to traditional mainstream neoliberal values, you have to act economically. This is the new moral economy. That is quite exactly the opposite of the moral economy of the peasantry, the way we had learned. And, but since everybody has worked on the double movement and Enzo's understanding of the double movement, I want to do the same thing, that is reading two sentences, a short sentence of Maurice Aymar and a sentence by Enzo, showing how for the understanding of Mediterranean migration within a Brodelian, that is, frame of the longue durée, it is, you may understand, you may see how the double movement is fruitful for describing these processes. Aymar writes, the past of the Mediterranean, the past, is here to remind us that everything is possible, war as well as peace, the refusal as well the acceptance of the other and the search for dialogue, the crusade as well the coexistence, the closure of the borders as well as the valorization of the role played by the various networks helping the various colonies and minorities, which is exactly what's happening in the Mediterranean now with the refugee crisis. And this is quite exactly the coexistence of a movement of embeddedness and disembeddedness. In fact, our mentor Mingione writes, the tendency toward disembeddedness is dominating now. Re-embeddedness, on the contrary, is creating a new social bound. Since, as Mingione writes, these people on the move, the migrants, I lost it. No. The refusal of the other and the acceptance of the other and the search for dialogue is a clear expression of a double movement constituted simultaneously. The point here is not that there is the age of embeddedness and the age of disembeddedness, or better, the age of disembeddedness and then the age of embeddedness as in the Great Transformation. Is that the two movements are simultaneous, as Mingione writes, and because there is two parts. This embedding motion activated by the competitive market and the re-embedding motion activated by the necessity to create new social bonds and social protections in order to keep societies alive. If this is if this is re-embeddedness, this is contradictory to the process of re-embeddedness from above. No, Lydia, no.
I don't get your last point.
Is Mingione's point, is this. Allora, Mingione writes, a double movement constituted simultaneously by two parts, disembedding motion activated by the competitive market forces and the re-embedding motion activated by the necessity to create new social bonds and social protections in order to keep society alive. Can this be consistent with the re-embeddedness from above?
With the de-embeddedness from above. Re-embeddedness. Sorry. It's a conflict, isn't it? Well, it's a battle. But the battle, well, who fights the battle from below? I mean, this is Marisol's point, I think, about the decline of traditional political organizations. I mean, insofar as I'm exploring this myself, I'd be looking to third sector organizations and looking to their interventions, both the content and the mode of intervention, whether that can translate into an alternative moral economy, if you like, is an empirical question. Shall I carry on talking? We would.
No, it's a different topic.
Yeah, okay, I'll just finish the point. So, I mean, we began to talk about this earlier as well. I would look at what is the mode of contestation and what's the scope for contestation and what are the potential audiences that could be engaged. And so do you then have a reversal of conceptions of moral standing? Do you re-moralize, if you like, or re-valorize the groups that have been devalorized? I mean, they are the dynamics that I would look toward. So I don't think Enzo's comment is in contradiction, but it does point to an inevitable conflict.
Yes, so finally, I would like to come back to how this morning Enzo pointed at causes for pessimism, of course. We are intellectuals, supposedly, and we are pessimistic by nature, but also optimism. And I completely share this view. And if I go back to what you said, Fabio, and I completely agree with you, it's true that now we are under a regime of securitization, and we witness an urbanization of security with a distribution of statuses and a lot of liberties being jeopardized in the name of security, mediating, belonging, and so on. So, and the future of the city is often thought from above. But however, I also find causes for optimism because, as Robert Sampson said a long time ago, and even before him, Clarwood and Piven, lower stratum people are not without capacity, and the powers that be better listen and react. They have presence, and they have numbers, and they can be heard. And being a French, I can testify for that. After the terrible terrorist attacks France experienced 2 years ago, 4 million people walked through the streets to defend their values, and they were extremely heterogeneous, but they shared a conviction that they would not let this jeopardize what they believed in. And there are many, many, especially at the moment also in France, with a lot of challenges. We could have yielded to pessimism, but a lot of grassroots movements are going on, and for the young generation, they give us hope, because as we said previously, the future is not written yet. We live in an instantaneous perception due to the media and the social media, and we react to now, and then, and here. But in fact, we should really think in the long term, in the 30 or 40 years to come, and we have a lot of things that we are not forcing at this moment that may happen. And this may not necessarily be a cause for pessimism. Thank you.
Okay. There is. Well, I think I would like to close by thanking all the speakers, and also thanks to the organizer for inviting me to chair this session. It's been a privilege, a great pleasure to have the opportunity to celebrate Enzo Mingione's work, and also to chair what has been quite an extraordinary session. We finished on time, and there was even some serious discussion between the panelists, which very rarely happens in this event. So thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for being with us.